Hello, and thanks for joining us today for this ITProTV webinar. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box throughout the webinar, and we will answer as many as we can at the end. You will receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. Now let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the ITProTV webinar series live from the ITProTV studios. I'm your moderator for today, Peter Van Rijsdam, and I'm here with your host, Daniel Lowry, and Don Pezet, today's presenter. Now, Don has 2 decades of experience in IT, and Linux is a passion of his. He is the co-founder of ITProTV, and he's taught several Linux courses like CompTIA Linux Plus and LPIC 1, as well as others, and he's currently filming LPIC 2 for ITProTV. And speaking of ITProTV, if you like what you see today, you'll be happy to hear that this is the format for all of the ITProTV courses. So what exactly is ITProTV? It's a place where you can watch and learn. We offer an engaging way to learn and grow your career. Whether you're just starting out or you're a seasoned IT pro, we've got the courses to meet your needs. CompTIA, Cisco, Linux, Apple, Microsoft, security, cloud, and more. All online, all on demand. Check us out at itpro.tv. Right now, a few housekeeping items before we get started. We want to hear from you today, so you're encouraged to ask questions. If you send in your questions today, you'll be entered to win an ITProTV t-shirt, much like this one. And if you're watching on the GoToWebinar platform, put your questions in the questions panel. And if you're watching on the on-air page, first, thanks for being a member, and you can put your questions in the chat. All right, Daniel and Don, let's get started with today's topic, what Linux distro is right for you.
All right, thanks so much for that great introduction, Peter. Always a pleasure having you a part of our team here. And today we have a really interesting webinar coming up your way, which is all about which Linux distribution is right for me. I have been using Linux for quite a few many years now, more than I fair to actually talk about. But so has Don. So we're going to kind of walk your way through, give you some options. Don's got a lot of really good information about the Linux distributions that are available to us. And he's going to help us traverse and path our way through to the right one for us. So Don, welcome. And thank you for coming on here and giving us this info.
Yeah, glad to be here. You know, I've worked with Linux for a long, long time. And in that time, I've used a number of different distros. And no matter how long you've worked with Linux, no matter how well you know a couple of your particular favorites, there's always new ones popping out. And if you ever get bored and do a Google search for the Linux family tree, you would be surprised how many distros there are. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different ones that are out there. And so that can be really daunting for somebody new to the field, just getting into using Linux. And it can be daunting for people who are already there. You're like, how do I know if there's something new on the horizon that I should be looking at or possibly moving to going forward? It's hard to keep up with. So we thought it would be a good idea to do a webinar like this one where we talk about some of the different, more popular distros that are available and how you go about selecting the right one, picking which one meets the needs for you, and understanding that there might be more than one you. There might be the you at home and then you at work, and there's different needs that come into play there. So we're going to talk about those, and then we'll run through some of the more popular Linux distros to see what Linux distro is right for you.
Now, Don, I've landed on the perfect Linux distro, which is Mandrake 2. So I've never had a reason to upgrade or look for another option. But apparently you say there are some considerations that we might want to take into play before we start walking down that road.
Absolutely. And if you've never heard of it, Mandrake 2, that would be what, like 10 years ago?
Probably more.
So
probably 20.
If you got a time machine, that one's a good option. But maybe you don't know that. I'm sure there are plenty of people that are running outdated distros or don't realize that their distro is not doing so well. So one thing that I think is really important for anybody before you even tackle individual distros is evaluating yourself and figuring out what is it that you need out of your Linux distribution, right? So there's a couple of considerations that I want to talk about, and I kind of got them outlined here. Whenever I'm picking a new distro, I've got to think about exactly what will I be using my computer for? Am I doing graphics editing? Am I just browsing the internet? Am I playing video games? Each of those use cases is really going to impact whether a distro is right for me or not. And one of the neat things about Linux is we have so many choices, so much flexibility that each distro is crafted where you could say, well, it's all Linux, right? But it's not like every Windows machine, which is basically Windows, or every Mac OS machine is just Mac OS. In the Linux world, a Linux distro can vary so much that it's hard to compare them. So we need to understand how we're going to be using that computer. We also need to think about what hardware and software we'll be using. not all hardware is supported by all distributions, right? Some Linux distros are really strict about having only open source drivers, and that limits the hardware they support, versus other ones like Ubuntu that'll incorporate binary blobs and support a lot more hardware. So that's going to influence my selection there. Same thing with software. Not every program is created equally, and if I'm relying on vendor support, I need to make sure I'm running a distribution that they do support officially. Otherwise, I won't be able to call tech support, and that's a problem. What do I do if I need help, right? I said, wait, what if I need to call tech support? Well, not every Linux distro has tech support. Many of them just have public forums that are available, and you can post on there. People will then make fun of your parentage and knowledge, and then maybe you get an answer. And Daniel's laughing because he knows.
Oh, it's totally true. There's a bunch of trolls here in the Linux community, unfortunately.
On a scale of 1 to 10, like, what are the odds of you getting a valid answer?
1.2.
Yeah. So there are some distros that are more friendly than others as far as getting support.
And the community itself as well. I mean, that's really what we're speaking to. It's not just the distro itself, but the community that kind of lives in it and supports it. You can find some people that like to do that there and tell you what's up.
There's some distros that rely on community support and have extremely toxic communities.
Yeah.
And so that's just not something you can rely on. And then lastly, what I think is probably one of the most important questions, how often are you comfortable upgrading, right? Now, as an IT enthusiast, I'm perfectly fine upgrading twice a year, right? Every 6 months, I'm fine with that, right? I get to try the latest and greatest. My OS is never more than 6 months old. But for many people, upgrading is a nightmare, right? I upgrade and my software breaks and I might lose some data. I got to move my data around. Permissions change. I got to learn these new features. They don't want to deal with that. And so if you look at like the Windows world, where major versions of Windows, now they've gone to a 6-month cycle themselves, but as far as major versions, it's every 3 to 5 years. Mac OS, they do a major version every year, but they continue to support their older ones for several years. So you don't have to upgrade for years at a time with those other options. And with some Linux distros, they even give you that ability to have slower upgrade cycles, but still get all the security updates. So that's going to influence whether a distro is viable for us or not, as well as the challenge introduced by upgrading. Some are harder to upgrade than others. So those are all questions you need to ask yourself before you even look at a distro, right? You got to know yourself to then know which distro is going to match up.
Now, Don, you also kind of mentioned the fact that there are maybe multiple versions of ourselves, and depending on which one we're talking about, we might have some other considerations to go along with that as well.
Absolutely. So let's highlight a couple of features here based on a use case, right? So the first use case is a business user. So if I'm going to be using Linux at work, what do I care about? I care about stability. I want this to work. Every day when I go in, I need it to function. I don't want to deal with tech support and troubleshooting and problems. I need it to be rock solid. I need support. If something ever does go wrong, I need to have somebody I can reach out to and actually get an answer and not have to be berated for how I spelled a word or something, So that's an important thing. I need security. If somebody hacks into this machine, I'm going to lose customer information. That's really bad. Cloud support. Maybe I'm deploying this in AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, in one of those places. And so I need to have support in those environments as well. And then lastly, I probably need not just a workstation version of the OS, but I need a server version as well. If I'm deploying on servers, I don't need a GUI and all this extra software that's just going to increase my security footprint. I want it to be lean and mean, exactly what I want. But on the workstation, I need the full feature set. I want to make sure there's a delineation there, a nice border that divides those two up so that I have flexibility of implementation. And there may be a few other needs, but these are kind of the 5 critical things a business user needs. And we can contrast that with a home user. Home user, very different, right? On the home user side, they just want a graphical user interface. They want a desktop. They don't need a server. It's a home user, right? They want cutting edge new features. They want the latest and greatest, whereas a business might choose to adopt older, more stable software versions. Gaming. Play video games, right? There's systems like Steam that allow you to download video games and play them. They give you Linux emulation for Windows games and so on. That's stuff a home user may care about. Business user, not so much. Well, if they want to keep their job, that's a kind of factor.
Nothing like sticking your old feet up on the couch there. And, what are you doing there, Billy? Cleaning out my desk?
Or will be soon.
Yeah.
Ease of use, right? A home user doesn't have a whole IT department there to support them. So they want something that's easy to use. and then applications. They want to be able to run the applications that are critical to them. Now, this has shifted a lot because a lot of applications these days are web-based. And so now there's not a whole lot of requirement on your operating system. But if you do have pre-existing applications, things like video games or like an Office suite, then you're going to want to have that same equivalence inside of your Linux distro. Very different perspective from a business user to a home user, and that's also going to impact which distro is right for you.
Okay, well, now that we've got that squared away, we've got it figured out. This leads us to the point of today's webinar, right? Which is, tell me which distro I should be using, or at least give me some idea of which way I should be going. Oh, wise one, that is Don Pezet. Help me, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope. What do we do? What's available to us?
All right. Well, what I did is prior to the webinar, I selected the 8 most popular Linux distributions in the United States. And I did limit it to the United States because some countries have various rules that change and it impacts which distros are more popular. So I had to limit it somehow. So I picked the 8 most popular. Now, you might absolutely love a distro that's not here on my slide, and that's fine. It's okay. It doesn't mean it's a bad distro, and we can certainly address it in the Q&A at the end if you want to talk about what are the advantages and disadvantages of those. But these are the 8 most popular. If I were starting out today, taking my first stab at Linux, it's going to be these 8 right here. And I don't know, Daniel, do we want to do a game here? Can you name the logos?
Oh, I could probably name most of them, if not all of them.
Well, let's have some fun with it, right?
Okay,
So
let's do it.
The first one's the easiest, right?
Yeah, that's Arch Linux.
Yep.
Right. Next one is CentOS, if I'm going across the top. Debian. Ooh, the next one's Fedora.
Fedora, yep, you got it.
Gentoo, Linux Mint, Red Hat, and Ubuntu.
There you go, 100%. So these, we know they're the most popular because Daniel knew what they were.
Right.
So
It just goes to prove their popularity, right?
Yep. Now, many of these are related to each other in one form or another. So, for example, CentOS, Red Hat, and Fedora are related. Debian, Ubuntu, they're related, or Linux Mint also are related. Some are really just independent standoff on their own, like Arch Linux and Gentoo, but these are some of the most common ones that are available today. And we're going to run through each one and talk about how they meet the needs of a particular type of user. And just to be fair, I've arranged them alphabetically. So we're going to start off with Arch Linux. Now, Arch Linux is one of the least popular of the list that I picked, and there's a reason for that because it is pretty difficult to use. Arch Linux is a distro that's built around the idea of control. They want you to have complete control of your operating system in ways that go way beyond anything Microsoft and Apple ever dreamed of. That when you install Arch Linux, you actually build your kernel package and copy it over. You build your initialization RAM disk. You build all these different pieces and throw them on the drive. You get to pick and choose everything. It's a free operating system, no cost, and you have complete control over every single bit.
It does cost a little self-esteem, Don, and ego.
I will say for somebody who really wants to learn more about Linux under the hood,
this is a good way to go.
It will, like Daniel said, highlight what you don't know and give you a chance to learn it and really see what's going on under the hood. So it's kind of like having a car. Maybe you know how to change oil, maybe you don't. Well, with Arch Linux, you're changing that oil.
I actually, to me, Arch Linux is the Linux community like that I've been aware of for the last 30 years or however long it's been that I've been using it. Because I remember the first time somebody told me about Linux, they said, oh yeah, you want to know what you think you know about computers? If you can get that installed, I'll be impressed. There was always this kind of air of, but when you did it, they were impressed. And you were like, okay, you had some gumption. You took charge, you had to learn some things, and you overcame it. And now you know a bit more about your computer. It's kind of like driving a manual transmission car, right?
Yeah, and it's a bit of a badge of honor for some people to say like, oh yeah, I installed Arch Linux. But there are some negatives to this. Well, hang on, let me finish on the positives, right? Yeah. So you mentioned you've heard about this distro for a long time. Many people have because their documentation is top notch. The Arch Linux wiki has practically everything you could ever hope for. So even if you don't run Arch Linux, a lot of times I'll find myself using their documentation because it's better than whatever applies to the distro that I'm currently using. So Arch Linux has really done a good job there. And if you want the latest Linux kernel, this is one of the best ways to do it because you can pull down the kernel code, you can deploy it, and you can run the latest and greatest, whereas other distros usually make you wait for a deployment window for that update to come across. Now, the negative side, Arch Linux does only support one architecture, and that is the x86-64, the 64-bit AMD architecture. If you run something else like 32-bit or PowerPC or Apple's M1, they don't support that. So you're on your own for those. So very, very limited. Most of the applications for Arch Linux are distributed as source code and have to be compiled, but they do have some binaries available. So if you don't want to go through the compilation process, you don't have to. And so that's another thing that's actually a little bit of a challenge is when an update comes out for an application, you don't just have to download it, you also have to compile it. And that creates a big headache for a lot of people. Arch Linux, I have found, is typically not suitable for business use, that it just isn't. It's not designed with that in mind. Its security footprint is not as strong as some of the other distros that are out there. But for a home user, an enthusiast, an experimentalist, somebody who wants to learn more about Linux, that's really what Arch Linux is designed for. It's not a great daily driver. It's more of a secondary kind of learning tool.
All right. Well, there you go. A little bit about Arch Linux. Hopefully you're probably going, okay, what's next on the block? Because this one is probably one of the more difficult ones to mess around with. That said, let's move on to your next one, which is CentOS. This has been my go-to like server Linux for a long time now. I haven't messed around with Stream yet, though.
Yeah, and CentOS Stream is a bit of a problem. So we're going to talk about Red Hat Enterprise Linux here in a minute, which is a commercial Linux operating system. CentOS was the free version of that. And so that meant for business users, CentOS was a great option. CentOS actually stands for Community Enterprise Operating System. So it's right there in the name. It's designed for businesses. It's free. Doesn't cost a dime. You can go and download it and load it. If you're a business and enterprise and you want to run this on 1,000 servers tomorrow, great, do it. Doesn't cost you a dime, right? In the past, it was completely aligned with RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and that meant you got stability and security for free. That's like a winning combo right there. But just a handful of months ago, IBM and Red Hat made the decision to change CentOS to not be fully aligned with RHEL, but instead to have some more cutting edge binaries and libraries in it. And that means it hasn't had the same amount of testing and isn't going to provide the same stability as RHEL. Obviously, they're doing that to preserve RHEL's market share, but that does make CentOS a little less attractive for businesses than it used to be. So those are some of the positives of CentOS. On the negative side, there is no support for CentOS. They do have community forums, and as far as forums go, their community is actually pretty good. You can post questions, and you usually do get an answer, and you'll see many other people going through the same challenges as you, but that's what CentOS does. And one thing they focus on, because of the way they align with RHEL, is stability. So they don't run cutting edge, the latest and greatest binaries. They usually are a bit behind. And I want to show you an example. So I mentioned with Arch Linux. So here's a screenshot of Arch Linux that I brought up yesterday. And if you take a look at Arch Linux, let me zoom in on this a little bit. You can see the kernel that it's running. So this is as of yesterday. This is current at the kernel is 5.11.11. I think the actual latest and greatest, if I were to go to the Git repository, is 5.19, but no distro has that yet. So Arch Linux is at 5.11. That's pretty darn current. Well, now let's jump over to CentOS. And so here's a CentOS install that I did. And if we take a look at it, it's kernel 4.18. It's not even in the 5 series yet, right? So we're not talking about months. We're talking about like a year or two behind the primary kernel development cycle. And that's because the folks over at Red Hat have tested and certified this kernel and said this is stable, reliable, and you are good to go to use this in a business environment.
Well, Don, I'm glad you brought this fact up, honestly, because it would be easy to look at those brute facts and go, oh, CentOS is just behind the times. It's total garbage. So I'm not going to use it. I'm going to go Arch, and then probably fail horribly if you're new to this, and then go, well, let me look at CentOS again, because maybe that's not so bad. So it's a good point to let people know it's all about stability with them and not just, are we on the cutting edge of this technology?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
All right, so where do we go next?
All right, well, Arch Linux is a standalone distro. They just created it basically from scratch. CentOS, we mentioned, was a derivative distribution. It was built off of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. The next distro I want to talk about is another one that it did have some origins in another distro, but is basically an independent distro now, which is Debian. Right now, there's some debate over the pronunciation, but it was named after.
Slap you.
It was named after the original developer and his wife at the time, so it was Deborah and Ian, so Debian. That's the name of the distro, and the reason they created it originally was they wanted a distro that was focused on developers. That if you're a developer, what do you need? You need programming tools, you need IDEs, you need all the different things that a developer works in every day. You need fairly current libraries to build your applications off of and have that support, and you just need application infrastructure in general. So that's where they got their origin. Now, it's evolved a lot over the years, but it still kind of serves that same purpose and is widely viewed as the developer-focused distro. It is free. Doesn't cost a dime, but as we've seen with many of the other free ones, there's no commercial support. You can't pay anybody to help you. You're just kind of thrown to the wolves. You can use their forums, their community, which I will say is not as friendly as the CentOS community because they're developers. They expect you to have a developer's level of knowledge. So if you're just getting into Linux, you're not really going to get much help from the Debian communities. But they're not bad. They're not like some of the ones that are out there. It's just not end user focused, right? It's really focused on people that are setting up web applications, infrastructure, developers, that type of thing. It is very stable though. So they are regarded as a distro that will take certain risks, but not exorbitant risks. So they will run basically the latest versions of software they can without introducing too much complexity and conflict and failure. So they are regarded as something that you could use in a business environment if you want. But in my experience, I found that the lack of commercial support is something that keeps them out of most commercial commercial environments. So I've worked at a number of companies that have used Linux in the production environment, and none of them use Debian. It's just not that common for that purpose. So if you're a home user learning about Linux, if you're a developer, that's where this one really shines.
Yeah, it does make sense that if it's easy to go, oh, well, it's free and there's a good community wrapped around it. Let me just go ahead and go with that. And maybe you have some familiarity with it. You maybe drove it around a little bit before, and now you're trying to spin it up, make it do something it really wasn't intended to do. That can get you in the weeds a bit.
And I do want to highlight one more thing. I mentioned how they take risks. They try and run latest versions of software. That's usually when it comes to the libraries, not the kernel, right? So remember Arch Linux I showed was at 5.11. Well, I brought up a Debian install yesterday, and I'll show you this one. It is running 4.19. So again, that 4 series, what's considered the more stable series. So Debian in this case has chosen stability over cutting edge. So that's another thing to keep in mind as you pick your distro.
All right. So the next one we got on the chopping block is, last time I checked, was Don's favorite because he's run it forever. I've seen he's got distro boxes on his desk. It's going to be Fedora, right?
Yeah. And I will say...
Or is it Red Hat you like the best?
Well, it depends on the situation, right? Okay. And I will tell you, I am changing. I'm shifting a little bit because the environment is shifting. But for many, many years, Fedora was my go-to distro. So if you saw me with a laptop, I could pretty much guarantee you that laptop was at least set to dual boot to Fedora, like mine is right now. So
not much has changed.
Not much has changed. But Fedora is an interesting one. Fedora is from the folks at Red Hat, right? So this is just like where CentOS was a derivative of RHEL. Fedora is not a derivative of RHEL, but it is completely bankrolled by the folks at Red Hat. It is designed to be an experimental OS. They throw everything and the kitchen sink at this. This is as cutting edge as you get when it comes to some of the software that it runs. Not always the kernel, right? Remember Arch Linux, I said you can get the latest kernel. Fedora, you can only get pretty close to the latest kernel. This one is very experimental, but very popular. And it has one big claim to fame to it, which is it's Linus Torvalds' choice.
Oh, name dropping.
Yeah, if you go and look at his computer, he's running Fedora. And that's because he is a kernel developer, obviously the most important one. And he needs to be able to test on a platform that's able to support that. And Fedora is the one that he's chosen for that. So that's a big feather in the cap of the Fedora project. It has current applications and libraries. It's always trying to stay up to date. It also has server and workstation editions, which is interesting because I think you'd be a fool to run it in production for a business. I'm saying this kind of jokingly, but as somebody who's been responsible for a Linux environment, I don't want to run test software in production. maybe in your test bed, if you've got a sandbox set up for your developers, because then they're getting ready for what's coming down the line for updates, maybe there, but not, I wouldn't have a production web server. It'd be nuts.
You don't like Sev1 tickets all day long? I mean,
Yeah,
what's wrong with that?
Well, it's not the Sev1 tickets. It's the hacker emailing me, letting me know they have all my data. You know?
This is horribly insecure, by the way, Mr. Pezet.
Yeah. Hackers normally skip the help desk process.
Yeah, they do. They do.
So,
Hey, a bug bounty program, maybe.
yeah, so I've got that down here as a con, right? Experimental features, not a good one. No commercial support on this one. It is community support only, and they do not do long-term support releases. That means a new version comes out every 6 months, and when a new version comes out, that day, support ends for the previous version. That's it. So you have to upgrade every 6 months to keep security updates and other things going. If you adopt Fedora on a desktop, that might be fine. I have no problem updating my desktop every 6 months. And I get the latest features and I get to try out cool stuff. But I'm a Linux trainer. I need to know the latest features, right? Most people don't want to deal with that. That's a big negative of the Fedora project.
Well, you don't want to be left holding the bag because you went with Fedora now, do you?
But there is that side of the kernel, and so I'll bring this one up. Here's my Fedora install from yesterday, and if I zoom in on this one to see what that kernel looks like, 5.8. Again, we saw 5.11 over in Arch, really a lot more current. Well, I shouldn't say a lot, just it's a couple of minor iterations. But at 5.8, Fedora is kind of leading as far as the easy-to-use desktops that are available that are out there.
I like it. I should play around with Fedora. It does look interesting to me. So I'm going to have to spin one up in a VM or something like that. All right, let's move on. Let's keep the train rolling. And this is going to be Don's facetiously favorites distribution, which is Gentoo Linux. Tell us a little bit about Gentoo, sir.
All right. Gentoo Linux has been around quite some time. This is one you'll hear about. It is an interesting one, right? With Arch Linux, remember how I said they wanted to give you complete control over everything? Well, so does Gentoo, but they take it to the extreme. Gentoo does not distribute binaries of anything, of the kernel, of the drivers, applications, nothing. It is a source-based distribution. And that means a couple of things. So first off, it's free, right? So Linux source code is freely available. So Gentoo is free. And then you have complete control. You get to pick what kernel you're going to run, what init system you want to run. Do you want systemd? Do you want sysvinit, upstart? You get to pick. It's up to you. What applications you want. Again, you get to pick all of this stuff, which is really cool. They support a ton of architectures. Because they distribute as source code, you have to compile the source code. And when you compile source code, you can cross-compile for whatever architecture you want. So do you have PowerPC? Fine. Who cares, right? Do you have ARM 64? Actually, one place where Gentoo really excelled was early on Xbox hacking. When people wanted to put a different operating system on their Xbox, they needed an OS that could cross-compile for that weird processor it had, and they used Gentoo Linux for that. That was one of the original Xbox replacements. So it's very flexible because of the nature that it's source distributed. But let me tell you, it's a freaking nightmare to try and support something like this.
Nice way to censor yourself there, Don.
So installing Gentoo Linux takes hours of time, even if you know exactly what you're doing, because you have to compile all the source.
Well, and what's fun is when you get like halfway through the install and you do something wrong and you're like, I'm starting over. Yay. And you're like, time 14 on your way through it. It's like, finally, Gentoo is installed. It's rough.
It's a challenge. It is rewarding to do. Yeah. So if you, again, if like Arch Linux, if you want to learn more about Linux and see what goes on in the hood, you will see everything inside of this one. But it's a huge amount of effort. Now, I will tell you, this is not designed for production use or even end user use anywhere, because every time an update for an application comes out, you're going to have to recompile it. The learning curve is as steep as it gets. It is insane. I've used Linux for over 20 years. I know my way around the system, and I don't know that I can install Gentoo Linux without following a guide. Like, there's just so much that's involved, and it takes so much time. In fact, and I'm going to out myself here a little bit on this. I've shown you guys a screenshot of each of these distros so far. I'm not doing a screenshot of Gentoo because it would have taken me 5 hours to get. And it looks just like all the other ones. But I will say that you can run literally the latest and greatest kernel on it because you just pull that source code down, compile it, and off you go. It's completely in your control.
All right, you go. If you want to get buck wild, you go Gentoo style, right?
There you go.
Now, Don, let's stop scaring the kids right here. Let's go with something a little more friendly, right? Something that is inviting to us and wants us to be a part of the Linux community and gives us a nice introduction to that. that. This is going to be Linux Mint.
This is the exact opposite end of the spectrum on this one, right? So now we're back to the world of completely pre-compiled distros that are easy to install. And actually, Daniel, you're the one who turned me on to Linux Mint years ago.
I know. I just happened to run across it one day. I was like, oh, I'll give this Linux Mint thing a try. And I was like, this is not a bad desktop experience. It was very nice. It was very user-friendly. I needed to do something, it could do it. If I need to install something, it could install, and ran very well. The performance was good. I really enjoyed the experience.
So this one has an interesting focus. Remember with Debian, how I mentioned their focus was on developers? Well, Linux Mint, their focus was on end users. They wanted to give the end users a pleasant experience. And sadly, that's not what most distros do. And so when you take a look at something like Fedora, it's running the GNOME desktop environment by default, and most people just aren't used to that way of functioning. Well, in Linux Mint, they've specifically designed it to be easy for end users that are coming from Mac or from Windows to be able to dive right in and get into the Linux world really quick. So it's free. It's user-friendly. They have several different supported desktops. Their default is Cinnamon, and I'm going to show you Cinnamon here in just a moment, which is honestly the best choice. But they've got Mate as well as XFCE support. On the negative side, they do just do a desktop. They don't do a server version. This is focused on end users, not servers. So in a business environment, you wouldn't be able to use it for your server infrastructure, or not that you wouldn't, you shouldn't use it for your server infrastructure, but you could use it for your end users, but no commercial support. So it's all community driven. And it's got delayed updates from the upstream. And I'll even tell you what that means. So Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is based on Debian. Now, they don't, like Linux Mint doesn't skip the hop and just go straight to Debian. They do fork right from Ubuntu. And when Ubuntu puts out a new update, Linux Mint doesn't pick that up for a few days or even weeks in some cases. And so that, if it's a high security update, they'll get it pretty quick. But if it's like some kind of feature update or whatever, there's usually a bit of lag between what you'll see in Ubuntu or even Debian all the way down to Linux Mint. So again, that's another one that makes it not really attractive for business use, but for the home user, it can be really attractive. Now, I will say I've seen a number of businesses use it. And the main reason is this screenshot right here.
Ooh.
So this is Linux Mint. It looks pretty when you first install it.
Pretty.
But in a lot of the other distros I've shown you, like in Fedora, let me go back to Fedora. Notice how there's a bar up at the top, but there's no bar at the bottom. I got a few applications running, but I wouldn't see that. I just see the active application up at the top left and so on. I just have to know that if I press the Windows key on my keyboard or my super key or my Ubuntu key, depending on who you buy your device through, then I know that GNOME is going to pop up the application screen and I'll see my recent applications and I can go from there. But that's not what most people are used to. Many people are used to Windows 95, the Windows paradigm of I've got a start button at the bottom left and a start menu that comes up. I got a system clock in the bottom right. I've got icons on my desktop, and that's exactly what Linux Mint delivers. And that makes it attractive to businesses because they don't have to retrain their users to get them moved over to it, and they can adopt it more rapidly. So that's a big cap in the feather of Linux Mint. But I'll say that I don't recommend it for businesses because you can actually do this with any distro. You just have to change the desktop environment. It takes a little work, but you can do it and usually have better support.
So the good news is we will not find this distro next to Gentoo in Helga's house of distro pain. It'll be in a nice repository. It's something we would want to go. If you're new to this is a great way to get into Linux without having to really struggle a lot. And you can start playing with things and start learning more about the operating system. I like it for that. I think it's great for that.
Yeah, it is. It is good. So I know we're starting to run a little on time. The two biggest distros just alphabetically ended up being last. So let's jump into them.
Let's do it.
We both mentioned Red Hat a few times. So Red Hat Enterprise Linux is the most successful commercial version of Linux available on the market today. That means it is not free. You got to pay for it. Costs money, right? But they have workstation and server editions that are available, so you can deploy it on your server infrastructure and take care of your end users with it. It is focused on stability, so it's not running the latest and greatest software that's out there. Again, just like we saw with CentOS and some of the others, the kernel version will be pretty far behind. There's that 4.18, same as we saw with CentOS, because they are still aligned on the kernel at least. But basically, it gives you that desktop environment. But the big thing about RHEL is it gives you commercial support. If something goes wrong, I can submit a ticket with Red Hat and get a real answer from a real engineer. I can call them on the phone and actually talk to a real engineer and get support. And I don't mean the offshore type of support that's super annoying. You get the real support. You get people that really know what they're doing. And it's just a real pleasure to work with them. not free. And so most home users are not going to adopt Red Hat. And I would say, even given the choice, Red Hat focuses on a smaller set of popular enterprise hardware. So it's not as hardware friendly as some of the other distros. But that stability, the long-term servicing branch they have, where they'll support their distros in some cases for 8 to 10 years. So you're not having to upgrade major versions for a long window of time. That's really attractive for a business.
Yeah, it's definitely made it the big hitter in the field because of those factors right there, and why you see job postings, right? It's RHEL. We do RHEL if you're looking for a Linux systems administration job. But that does bring us into the idea of Ubuntu as well, kind of the other heavy hitter. I'm a big fan. I know you don't like it very much, though.
All right.
You haven't liked it historically.
So Daniel, you've known me a long time.
I have.
And for many years, I have complained about Ubuntu, and I will tell you,
lot.
Ubuntu it's a Linux distribution, but it's from a company called Canonical. So there's an actual company with funding behind this, which is an attractive feature in a distro. You know, it's not going away tomorrow, right? Nobody wants to invest in some distro that's going to fly by night and be gone. I've criticized it in the past because they've made several bad decisions. It's a fairly bloated distro, has a lot of extra software in it that people don't need, or they went with that Unity interface that totally sucked. And so these were real problems. But in the most recent versions of Ubuntu, they have really turned things around. In 18.04 and in 20.04, they've gone back to a standard desktop environment. They use GNOME just like about everybody else. And they moved away from that weird interface they had. And they've really dialed down the amount of software included in their default install. And in my opinion, it's just really a big turnaround for them. They've really done a lot to improve it. And so most of the criticisms I've thrown against Ubuntu in the past are not really valid anymore. I will still, to my grave, complain about the stupid purple terminal they default to, right? They haven't fixed
weird.
that.
I'll agree with you on that one. That is a strange thing to do.
But otherwise, they really excel at a few things. So first off, they are free. And see what I put? Free-ish?
Free-ish.
It's free. You can download it. You can install it today. You can run it just fine. Never pay them a dime. But you know what? If something goes wrong, you can actually pony up a little dough and call them on the phone. And you can actually get paid support. And that bridges a big gap for people, right? For home users, they're not normally thinking about support until they absolutely need it. Ubuntu's free. You don't have to worry about it till you need it. And for businesses, same thing. You can buy the support if you want it. You don't have to if you don't need to. They do have long-term servicing editions. Every 2 years, they release one that they say will support for 5 years beyond that. It gives you a nice big window so you're not forced to upgrade. And huge vendor support. They're open to taking in closed source binaries. So a lot of your wireless cards will just work by default in Ubuntu, which is great, really makes things easy. They do have server and workstation editions. And more importantly, in today's world, they have IoT editions. They have fully supported versions for Raspberry Pis, every model now. So if you're dealing with IoT, it's a great way to get a full version of Linux, not that crazy Raspberry Pi OS they distribute. That's a security nightmare. Here we can use actual Ubuntu. So I've deployed this for a number of appliances. If you're a video gamer, Steam.
I like how you put an exclamation point there. Is that a part of there?
Hey, no.
Were you putting emphasis?
I put that there.
Yeah.
Valve, the company that makes Steam, they only support Ubuntu. That's their distro of choice. Now,
so if you're a gamer, and you want Linux, this is it.
Yeah, I mean, you can hack it to get it into Fedora or other distros, but this is the one they actually support. So if you're a video gamer on Linux, Ubuntu is kind of your choice. That's the one that you go to because of that. There are some negatives. It is still a little bloated. There's some stuff in there that shouldn't be. Like, I absolutely hate the Snap subsystem. And even if you do a minimal server install of Ubuntu right now, it installs that damn Snap system. And so that's one of the first things I do. I install it, I do my updates, I remove snaps. Like, that's just what I have to do. And it's got support for LXC. That was Canonical's container system they really pushed. God forbid anybody use Docker. Got to use LXC. Well, you know what? People use Docker. So now I got to remove LXC as well. The Unity interface, they've actually ended support for that. There's a few people who have taken it up as an open source project to try and keep it going. Who knows if Ubuntu will ever try and go back to that or not. If I hope we're past that. So there are some negatives that are about the operating system. But as a whole, they've done something really interesting. They've created a distro that is great for home users as well as business users on the desktop and on the server and on IoT. If you're looking for one distro that you can run everywhere, Ubuntu is really the only choice, not just the best choice.
It's kind of the jack of all trades when it comes to Linux, right?
Yeah. So let me just give you an example. Let's say I'm a business.
Okay. You're a business.
I'm a business. And I'm creating a web application and I want to put it in AWS.
Okay.
And I learn about AWS load balancing and Elastic Cloud. I want to be able to auto scale from 5 servers to 500 servers.
As you do.
So I say, all right, well, I make money on this, so I want to go with RHEL. I want commercial support. I want stability. I'm going to go with RHEL. Well, when I have 5 servers, I have to have 5 licenses. When I go up to 500 servers, how many licenses do I need?
5?
500. And I've got to buy those in advance. And if I don't have those, how do I scale, right? And or if I do the automatic stuff through Amazon, now I'm paying. It gets really expensive as it scales up. Or I could go with Ubuntu. And I could say, you know what? I'm going to take my sandbox that has 5 servers and I'll buy support licenses for all that. And then I'll have my auto-scaling production cloud that can go up to 1,000 servers and I won't buy support for them. And so if I have a problem, I can solve it in the sandbox. I can solve it in the staging environment and then push the fixes up into production. And so it's got a way lower cost of ownership to have. The commercial support is there, but it's totally free if you want to learn and get started. And so honestly, I'm not ready to take this plunge yet, but I will say that Ubuntu is really gaining a foothold in my heart is one of my kind of go-to distros.
This is the first conversation of, and eventually he's like, oh yeah, and I run Ubuntu. That's how it is now. It's my favorite. I love it. Now we've gone through a lot of the popular distros. There's one that's like kind of oddly off your list because doing what I do for a living, I hear about it a lot. I use it all the time. You probably hear about it all the time as well, and that's Kali Linux. I can't believe you didn't bring that one up.
You know, I didn't bring that one up. In fact, I'm willing to generalize here because that's how we create arguments on the internet.
That's right.
If I didn't talk about the distro here, with maybe the exception of SUSE Linux, if I didn't talk about the distro here, it's probably not appropriate for you to run it on your actual hardware. And Kali's a great example. Kali is a pen testing distro, so it's focused on security professionals, people like Daniel, right? But even the Kali people here, I've got a shot from their webpage, even they have a whole article here. It says, should I use Kali Linux? And if you read through the whole article, the answer is basically no, you shouldn't, right? And so
they really know how to sell it, don't they?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because they basically tell you, look, we had to change a lot of security settings in this distro to make it to function a certain way. And in some cases, it actually weakens the security. It's not designed for production use for your laptop, for your servers, or anything like that. It's designed for pen testers to use as a tool to evaluate networks and locate vulnerabilities. Like that's what its function is. So understand that there's a ton of special purpose distros that are out there, and special purpose distros are rarely designed to be run on your laptop. Right? They might be designed to be run as a virtual machine in Azure or somewhere like that. You need to know what the intent was for that distro.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because they do harp on the fact that this is not meant for everybody to be using. This is for penetration testers and security professionals. So if you're doing that, then hey, go grab Kali. It's wonderful. We all love it. It's great. That said, Don, we've gone through a lot of information. I bet there are people out there chomping at the bit to get some questions toward us. I know Peter's probably got a couple of them teed up for us.
I do. You are right. Before I get to the questions, too, I want to mention my favorite comment here. I'm watching the on-air page is Noe saying, Don is a Linux god. And that was in all caps.
Been elevated to deity.
So, well, there we go.
Congratulations on that, Don. But the first question we're going to get to is from Michael in Brooklyn, New York, who says, for someone that is brand new to Linux, what is the difference between using WSL2 on Hyper-V or Hyper-V on Windows 10 Pro, specifically Arch Linux is what they're running?
Okay, yeah. So honestly, WSL2 is just Linux in a virtual machine. And in fact, if you do the default, it's Ubuntu. I think it's still 18.04. 20.04 is available, but 18.04 is what it defaults to. So basically, when you drop into a WSL shell, you're in an Ubuntu virtual machine. So it's just the same as running it. It is virtualized. A Hyper-V is a Type 2 hypervisor, though, so it's running on, Type 2 runs on the hardware. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's a bare metal hypervisor, so you get basically hardware level performance, which is good. It's not so great with the GUI. I know there's a few different ways you can kind of hack a GUI onto it, but if you just want Linux from the command line and you don't want to give up your Windows machine, WSL2 is great. WSL1's a different story, right? That one is not truly running the Linux kernel. It's built on top of the Windows API, so a lot of stuff is broken in it. But WSL2, it's just a virtual machine. And so it's full Linux support.
Oh, man. I actually was talking to Don about this the other day because I was building a new laptop, and I don't like Hyper-V. So I had to go with WSL1, but I love having that Linux capability right there in Linux, or I'm sorry, inside of Windows without having to have a virtual machine per se.
WSL2 does force you to use Hyper-V, so you wouldn't be able to use VirtualBox or VMware Workstation or whatever. And
Which I use both.
So there's a reason not to use it.
All right, what else you got, Peter?
You know, we're getting a lot of questions about CentOS and the changes that they're making and kind of what alternates people can look to. But our first one's from Christoph, watching on the on-air page. It says, what do you think about CentOS moving to liquidate LTS line and go to a rolling distro? How will the market react to this?
So I can tell you that I've talked to a number of organizations that are out there that have heavily invested, I shouldn't say invested because it's free, right? But have heavily deployed CentOS in their networks. And many of them are migrating their workloads over to Ubuntu. It's actually driven a lot of, because it comes down to that whole scaling and licensing thing that with Ubuntu or CentOS, you don't have to track your licenses. But with RHEL, you do. And so that's a real headache for people that are going to adopt that as their primary distribution. Some people are going ahead and making the shift from CentOS to RHEL. There's a few other people out there, like the original founder of the CentOS distribution. He is kind of putting out his own, I think it's called Rocky Linux or something of that nature. I think it's Rocky Linux. Either way, it doesn't matter. Let's say he puts out that distro today. Well, I don't trust new distros on day one, right? It's like when you buy a car. You don't want to buy the first model year of a car, or even worse, if a whole new car brand launches, you don't want to buy the first one. You want to wait and see, are they going to make it? Right? Are they going to provide the same level of support? I know Cloud Linux is another one where they're trying to basically fill in that gap of what CentOS used to do. Technically, Oracle Linux was based on CentOS. I'm not sure if they're going to rebase right off of RHEL or not. So there may be a few other options, but it's just too soon. So if you can stay on the version of CentOS that you're on right now, you certainly can. But if you want to come up with something long-term, it's too early to tell which alternatives are going to stick around. And so my recommendation would be to move that workload over to one of the other distros like Ubuntu.
And just while we're on this same topic, Brian had mentioned Rocky as well, but Leo had mentioned Alma. Have you heard of that, or is that a good alternative?
So I have heard of Alma, but I haven't had a chance to actually look into it. So I haven't pulled down source code. I don't think they've put an actual installable version out yet, but I might be wrong because this would have been like a month ago that I looked at it. So but I can't really speak on that one.
All right, next up we have Jerry from Jacksonville, Florida asks, as a newbie to Linux OSs, sometimes reading a man page can be challenging. Understanding the syntax is essential to using commands. Can you recommend a source that explains the syntax used in help in manual pages?
Yeah. So one of my favorite tools that are out there is a website called cheat.sh, cheat.sh. It is a no-nonsense web page. If you just do, like, you open up a web browser and type cheat.sh / and then a command, like, grep, right? So cheat.sh / grep. Then it gives you several examples. Here's 5 examples of how you can use grep and what the command line arguments mean for each one, how you're going to achieve this. So really great way to learn that. And I actually take it and write it as a function into my shell. So from the command line, I can just type cheat in a command and it'll give me that reference real quick.
I've always said that is the biggest disadvantage of using man pages. They have horrible examples, if any at all. Yep. And examples is really what helps me understand how it's supposed to be used. Where am I supposed to put this? How does that look when I'm adding functionality to it? If I'm using a switch or anything like that, an argument, how does that supposed to look? Without an example, it's just really hard to figure out. And then you just kind of got to try a bunch of times and fail a bunch of times.
Yeah, and there's tools like rsync, where there's really just, 5 different use cases for rsync. And so you do cheat.sh / rsync, and then you get those 5 examples right there. So, all right, I want to synchronize data between 2 servers. I want to copy data one way between 2 servers. And it's just right there and easy to do. So there's plenty of other websites that do a great job of explaining the stuff too, but that's the one that I actually use myself.
All right, next up, Jeff, who's watching on the on-air page, says, what do you think about GNOME 3 versus GNOME 2?
So there were some big holy wars over that one. GNOME 2 was the older design style that many people liked. And when you look at desktop environments like Mate is actually based on GNOME 2. It's people that didn't want to move away from GNOME 2 to go to the GNOME 3 world. All right. But I'll say for me personally, I adapted to GNOME 3 pretty quick. And the thing that helped, that made a difference, if you follow the Windows world, when Windows 8 came out, it had this crazy touch interface and everybody hated it and it was a nightmare. And then they kind of had to fix that in Windows 10 and beyond. Well, that's how GNOME 3 was. When GNOME 3 came out, people hated it. They didn't want to adapt. But Linux gives you so many choices that people took the other choices. Versus like in Windows where you didn't have a choice. You can learn the new stuff and that was that. Well, the interesting part for me was with GNOME 3 and even like Windows, if you closed your eyes and just used the keyboard, the syntax was actually the same as what it was under GNOME 2. So like if I wanted to run a program, it was really rare that I would click to bring up a menu, find a folder, find a program and click it. Instead, I would hit my super key or Windows key or whatever on your keyboard, and then I would just type the first few letters of the command and press enter. And that works under GNOME 3 just like it did under GNOME 2. So it's really the same way to use it. But if you haven't learned that way, if you're not relying on keyboard, I guess maybe I'm a little more reliant on keyboard than most people, that made it easy for me to switch over. I will also say that most distros ran X Windows as their window manager for the longest time. Now we're seeing things move over to Wayland as the desktop compositor of choice. And GNOME 3 just has better Wayland support than GNOME 2, and that means that sooner or later you're going to end up on GNOME 3 if you're going to stay in that GNOME environment. And really, you probably should have switched. This all happened, 10 years ago? It was a long time ago.
Yeah, is GNOME 4 out?
I don't think
is
so.
Is it coming out? Yeah, I don't know. Something in my brain's telling me it's close, if not out already.
They got burned so bad last time, they're probably taking their time.
All right. Well, I mean, I agree with Don on all that as far as like if you're still in the previous thing and now you're looking for support to more current technologies, you're going to want to move up.
Great. All right, our next question comes from Christoph, and I'm sorry if I am butchering your name, but I confirmed in the chat that he's got 2 Z's in Christoph, but he said I'm close enough with,
Man, I wish
with
I had
pronouncing
2
it
Z's
that way.
in my name.
I
It's
know,
just
right?
badass.
Daniel with 2 Z's.
Yeah.
Well, he asks, what books would you recommend to learn Linux, and not only books for beginners?
There's a couple of really good books that are out there. I like No Starch Press. No Starch Press, really all of their Linux books are good. They cover a lot of really interesting things there. There's the Linux Cookbook. There's like the Administrator's Handbook. There's a few others that are there. I'd have to go look at my bookshelf to see the titles because I have most of them. So definitely check out No Starch Press. Those books are usually pretty affordable and really good entry points into Linux. There's a few others that are out there. I know there's one by Wiley that it was the LPIC 1 book, which does a great job. If you want the Linux Professional Institute Certification Level 1, LPIC 1, that book does a great job of covering a lot of what's in there. And we actually have LPIC 1 content on the ITProTV site. So if you're a video learner and you want to go that route, you can come and learn from me. And I kind of say we follow the same exam objectives, right? I follow a different order than the book, but we cover the same topics, so you can actually align the two.
I always like the Linux Administrator's Bible. I think that's what it was called. It was really good. I use them more as a reference than it is a learning thing. So when I try to figure out what to do, I'm like, oh, let me grab this book. Oh, there it is right there. That's how you do this thing.
That's a big old book.
It's a big old book.
You couldn't read that one cover to cover.
No. That's definitely a reference and not a light-leaning, I love Linux. It's such a nice story. No.
Yeah.
Use it to prop your car up instead of block. All right, this next question is from John from the on-air page. I think this is a cool one. What problems would you run into running multiple Linux environments? Like if you have Fedora in your test and another distro in your production, are there issues you could run into? I thought there were some pretty significant differences.
Sure. You can actually get away with it for some things. So here's the types of challenges you bump into. So at a minimum, let's say you've got a web application that relies on Node.js. And so if your if your sandbox dev environment is running Fedora, you might be running a very new version of Node.js, like Node 14, Node 15, right? But then when you deploy in production, if you're running RHEL has like Node 11, I think, is what's packaged in it as the supported version. And so there's a lot of stuff that breaks, doesn't work right. It's several versions behind because that was the stable, secure version that they've stuck with. And so that wouldn't be a viable option. You could not have your dev environment in Fedora and your production environment in RHEL if you relied on an application like Node.js, unless you installed it manually, like if you pulled the source from Node and installed it that way. So that would be a headache you'd have to overcome. There's other challenges you can bump into with hardware. Some distros use UEFI support, some don't. Some have different architecture support that might cause a problem. different kernel versions can be an issue, but also security layers. That if you have SE Linux in your staging environment, but then AppArmor in your production environment, that can wreak havoc too. So you can mix and match as long as the key ingredients kind of align and you've got the right versions of software in the right place. It's not something I'd do, though, not if I could avoid it.
I'd be interested in hearing the edge case scenario where that's what you would want to do for whatever reason. Maybe that's something you've been kind of forced into doing for X, Y, and Z reasons. But again, you got to go back to trying to get that homogeneous environment so that everything works right?
Yeah, and if you have multiple environments, right? So if you have a sandbox, dev, staging, production, right? The four environment
The four
cycle.
horsemen.
Yeah, I know. So the sandbox where the developers can go absolutely nuts, and then dev where they're actually doing their development, and then staging, which is a mirror of production, right? So if staging and production are truly mirrored, you probably could deviate and have your dev environment be something different, right? And you would detect it in staging before the problem actually made it into production. But otherwise, you need to limit the other versions to sandbox. So in sandbox, maybe there's where you have Fedora. But then in dev, staging, production, that's all whatever you're choosing to fully support.
All right, sounds good. The next question is a cool one from Jim. He says, I have several Linux machines in my environment. Is there an Active Directory equivalent to manage them, or do we have to be managed individually? And someone in the chat also suggested maybe Samba?
Yeah, so Samba's a good answer. So let me start with that, right? And if you ask a lot of Linux professionals that are out there, Samba is the way to go, which is basically just a reverse engineered hacked version of Microsoft's Active Directory. All right. Now, I've used Samba in production and it sucks. So, it is hard to keep it operational. And because it is reverse engineered and hacked, if you actually start joining Windows machines to that, things break pretty quick. So if it's just Linux, then yeah, Samba actually does a pretty good job and you can have a directory. You can use OpenLDAP. You can even stand up some of the old NIS Plus domains. That functionality is still there back from the Sun Microsystem days. And that will give you a common user directory across your systems. So there's a few options. The one I'm trying to remember, OpenIAS? No, that's not it. It's kind of really been gaining some traction in the last few years, and I'm forgetting the acronym for it now. Darn it, it's going to occur to me afterwards.
You just lost your deity status.
I know. But basically, it's a directory server that's specifically developed for Linux and is very reliable.
Does it use LDAP like Active Directory? Is that what it's doing? Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's not like reverse engineer hacked on somebody else.
It's just
they built it themselves. Yeah.
Smart.
And so it's been gaining some market share. In fact, I'm going to cheat
Yeah,
and go
do
real
it.
quick so I can
Cheat.
find it. But it's I think OpenIAM, something of that nature. It's 3 letters. I'm just getting the wrong letters.
You can do it, Don. We have faith in him. he knows these things. When you have this much information in your brain as Don does, sometimes it gets pushed out of the way.
Yeah.
And you're like,
Yeah.
oh, you failed me, stupid brain.
Yeah. So, but OpenLDAP is actually very mature. It's been around a while, but it's not as full featured. You know, in like a Microsoft Active Directory, you have group policy objects. There's not really something that aligns to that in the Linux world. Instead, there you would need to use Ansible or some kind of deployment software to be able to actually manage those systems. And you can enforce policies that way through Ansible, but that wouldn't solve your user directory problems. So that's where OpenLDAP would come in.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, and Don will look that up, and hopefully we'll have that answer soon. But stay tuned, as we're going to announce the winner of the ITProTV T-shirt really quickly. If we couldn't get to your questions during the webinar, don't worry. Don will be answering them in overtime on the ITProTV on-air page after the webinar. I'll explain more about that in just a moment. You can check out a free ITProTV membership, no credit card required, with access to select courses and our daily live feed. You can also get a full personal membership that provides complete access to all the ITProTV courses with or without practice exams and virtual labs. Now, if you're on a team, you'll want to check out the business page, which offers a tour of the Pro Portal used to maximize your team's investment in training. Don't forget to enter the promo code Webinar30 when you sign up for an ITProTV membership to get 30% off the lifetime of your personal membership. All right, now it is time for the winner of the T-shirt, and let's see. It looks like it is Daniel from Northridge, California.
I'm not from Northridge.
Not you, Daniel.
Oh.
It is another Daniel from Northridge, California. So congratulations, Daniel. We will reach out to you to get that info from you to send the shirt. All right, well, we've run out of time here for this webinar, but we still have a lot more questions to get to, and we'd love to answer those. So we're going to go into overtime on the ITProTV on-air page to continue answering those questions, but this is for ITProTV members only. Now, you can become a member today for no cost by signing up for a free membership right now. One of our team members will put the link in the chat for you. It's quick and simple. So we'll take a 5-minute break now to give you some time to sign up, and we'll see you there. So on behalf of Don and Daniel, thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. You will receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. Remember that coupon code is webinar30. See you back here for the next ITProTV webinar.